During what most know as the Roswell UFO incident, we captured an alien, but this alien knew our language, but also knew something we never have imagined capable of understanding. It knew about God, our God, and how we have failed him. It gave us a warning, one impending doom that is approaching faster than ever. I never believed in God. 23 years in federal law enforcement will do that to you. You see the worst of humanity day after day, and you start to wonder what kind of deity would allow such darkness to flourish unchecked. The answer I settled on was simple and cold: none. We were alone in a godless universe, making our own meaning, fighting our own battles against chaos and evil. That certainty lasted until I spent 6 weeks listening to an alien describe the crucifixion in perfect detail, 2,000 years after the fact, and explain why humanity was racing toward a choice between heaven and hell on earth. By the time I understood what I'd heard, it was too late to do anything about it. That failure has haunted me for 47 years. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. The assignment came through channels I didn't even know existed within the Bureau. No briefing packet, no advance warning, just a secure call at 11:30 on a Tuesday night and instructions to be ready for pickup in 20 minutes. A black SUV arrived exactly on schedule, driven by 2 men in suits who wouldn't give their names, wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't even confirm which agency they worked for. They just drove 3 hours into the Nevada desert, past the tourist traps and conspiracy theorist camps clustered around Area 51, into terrain so barren even the hardiest desert plants gave up trying. We arrived at a chain-link fence that appeared suddenly out of the darkness, topped with razor wire and cameras that tracked our approach. Guards in unmarked uniforms checked credentials I'd been given in the SUV, credentials that identified me with a number rather than a name. The gates opened and we descended into a facility that didn't appear on any map I'd ever seen, taking elevators that dropped so deep my ears popped twice before we reached bottom. The pressure change alone told me we were several hundred feet underground, buried in bedrock that would survive anything short of a direct nuclear strike. The base was old, built in an era when paranoia was policy and secrecy was survival. Concrete corridors stretched in every direction, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with a frequency that made my teeth ache and my head throb after prolonged exposure. Personnel moved with purpose but never made eye contact, everyone wrapped in their own classified bubble, careful not to see or hear anything beyond their specific clearance level. The air tasted recycled, filtered through systems that removed everything organic until you were breathing something that felt closer to the vacuum of space than the desert atmosphere above. I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down, could sense the isolation of being so far from natural light and open sky. They brought me to an observation room overlooking an interrogation chamber. Through the one-way glass I could see a standard setup. Metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs facing each other, recording equipment mounted in all 4 corners with redundant systems that ensured every word and gesture would be captured from multiple angles. But the figure in the far chair was anything but standard. The being sat motionless, its form humanoid enough to trigger recognition but wrong in ways that made your brain stutter trying to process the details. Gray skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating shadows that didn't quite match the room's illumination. Proportions slightly off in every dimension, limbs too long and joints that bent at angles human anatomy wouldn't allow. Large eyes that held depths I couldn't measure, black and reflective like polished obsidian, seeing everything and revealing nothing. The briefing officer, a man whose face I've tried and failed to remember clearly in the decades since, explained in clipped military tones that the entity had been in custody since July 1947. Roswell wasn't a weather balloon. It was the truth everyone suspected but no government could afford to confirm. They'd kept it alive through means he didn't elaborate on, kept it talking through methods that probably violated every convention on prisoner treatment for over 7 decades. My role was simple on paper: observe the interrogation sessions, analyze the responses for patterns or deceptions, and file reports through channels so secure they would be buried deeper than the base itself. I took the assignment because I was good at reading people and because I didn't believe any of this mattered. An alien in custody was impressive, sure, but it was just another classified secret in a government full of them. The interrogation sessions lasted 6 to 8 hours, sometimes longer if the entity was being particularly forthcoming. They happened every other day, giving time for analysis and preparation between sessions. I settled into a routine over the first week, arriving at the observation room with coffee and notebooks, watching as different interrogators took their turns trying to extract useful intelligence. The being answered most questions, though it controlled the flow of information with surprising skill. Some topics it would discuss in elaborate detail. Others it would deflect with responses that seemed cooperative but revealed nothing of substance. It was playing a game, I realized, but I couldn't determine what the rules were or what it hoped to win. The first thing that struck everyone was the language ability. The being spoke perfect English, but not modern American English. It used vocabulary and grammatical structures from different eras, sliding between Shakespearean formality and contemporary slang with seamless ease, as if it had absorbed centuries of linguistic evolution. When one interrogator tried speaking French to test its capabilities, the being responded in medieval French, then Renaissance French, then modern Parisian dialect, switching between them to demonstrate it understood not just the language but its historical development. It did the same with German, with Spanish, with Mandarin. It spoke dead languages that shouldn't have been possible for it to know: Sumerian, ancient Egyptian, languages that had been extinct for millennia, pronounced with confidence that suggested first-hand knowledge rather than academic study. By the end of the second week, the interrogation teams had established a baseline. The being was intelligent, cooperative within limits, and possessed knowledge that shouldn't have been possible. It described historical events with the detailed precision of an eyewitness, correcting our history books on matters both trivial and profound. It explained technologies we were still developing, offering insights that would have been invaluable if anyone had been willing to believe they came from a genuine alien source rather than some elaborate deception. The second week had been devoted to establishing the being's credibility on verifiable matters. It described the construction of Stonehenge with engineering precision that archaeologists couldn't match, explained the true purpose of the pyramids in ways that made our theories look like educated guesses. It recounted conversations between historical figures that no record had preserved, described battles from perspectives that no surviving account contained. Every verifiable detail checked out perfectly. Every prediction about where we'd find lost artifacts or buried ruins proved accurate. The being was either telling the truth about observing human history, or it was the most elaborate liar ever encountered. Specialists from various fields were rotated through observation duty during those early weeks. Linguists marveled at the being's command of dead languages, its ability to explain etymologies and linguistic evolution with native fluency. Historians challenged it on obscure details from different eras and cultures, trying to catch it in contradictions or anachronisms. It passed every test, answered every challenge, provided information that sent researchers scrambling to archives to verify claims that turned out to be accurate. The consensus among the analysts was uncomfortable but unavoidable. This being had been present throughout human history, watching and recording everything we'd ever done. But the real breakthrough, the moment everything changed, came during the third week, when a new interrogator asked about religion. The shift in the being's demeanor was immediate and profound. It straightened in its chair, and for the first time since I'd been observing, something like emotion flickered across that alien face. Not human emotion, not exactly, but something close enough to recognition that it made my skin crawl. The being spoke about the One, capitalizing the words with verbal emphasis that made them distinct from everything else it had said. The One who created all things, who set the universe in motion with purpose and intent, who visited worlds to guide those civilizations, ready to receive guidance and wisdom. My hands gripped the edge of the console in front of me. Coffee forgotten. Skepticism temporarily suspended by the absolute certainty in the being's voice. The interrogator pressed the question. Did the being claim to worship God? The entity made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely. a vibration that didn't quite translate to human expression. No, it said, they did not worship. They served. They were created for a purpose, fashioned by the One to observe and record, to bear witness to the unfolding of creation across dimensions they could barely comprehend. They were servants, watchers, those given the privilege of seeing the One's work across countless worlds and civilizations. And Earth, the being said with something approaching sadness, Earth was unique among all the worlds they had observed. Unique in its stubbornness, unique in its refusal, unique in its determination to ignore wisdom even when offered directly by the Creator. Over the following sessions, the being elaborated on that theme. It spoke of countless worlds, civilizations spanning galaxies, species that had evolved to consciousness and been visited by the One. Some were guided gently through the challenges of development, learning cooperation and compassion as natural extensions of survival. Others required more direct intervention, messengers sent to teach principles that would prevent self-destruction. A few, very few, were visited by the One directly, the Creator taking form appropriate to the species to walk among them and demonstrate the proper path. Earth was one of those rare worlds. We had been given the direct attention of the divine, and we had rejected it completely. The interrogator, a woman in her 50s with military bearing and eyes that had seen too much, asked directly during the 4th week, had the being witnessed the crucifixion? The silence that followed felt like the air pressure dropping before a storm. I leaned forward in the observation room, pen hovering over notebook, suddenly certain that whatever came next would be important. The being closed its eyes, a gesture so human it made my rational mind recoil and began to speak. It described a hill outside Jerusalem on a spring morning 2,000 years ago, described it with the detailed precision of someone who had been there, who had watched from beginning to end, who had recorded every moment for reasons we couldn't begin to understand. The details were wrong at first, that's what I thought. History and faith had smoothed the crucifixion into something almost bearable, a religious symbol more than a historical event, suffering made sacred and therefore distant. But the being described the reality with clinical precision that stripped away 2,000 years of theological interpretation. It described the mechanics of crucifixion in detail that made the interrogator's face go pale. The way the nails were driven through wrists rather than palms, through the space between bones where they could support body weight without tearing free. The suffocation that came from hanging by your arms, chest muscles failing over hours until you couldn't draw breath, forced to push up on legs that would eventually fail. The insects that came for the blood and the bodily fluids that inevitably followed. The crowds that gathered not for solemn witness but for entertainment, that jeered and mocked, that threw stones and worse, that treated execution as public spectacle. The being described the heat of that day, the smell of sweat and blood and human waste, the sounds of men dying slowly while soldiers gambled for their possessions. It described how long the process took, how the human body fights desperately against suffocation even when survival is impossible, how consciousness fades and returns in cycles of agony. It had watched 3 men die that day, observed the entire process from dawn until the bodies were taken down, and it remembered every detail with the perfect recall of a created being designed specifically to witness and record. The being paused in its recounting, and for a moment that alien face showed something that might have been respect or reverence. It said that what made this crucifixion different, what elevated it above the countless others it had witnessed throughout Roman occupation, was who hung on that center cross. The One could have prevented every moment of suffering, could have stopped the nails from being driven, could have broken the cross, could have struck down the executioners with less effort than humans swat insects. The power to unmake the entire Roman Empire existed in that dying body. But it remained unused. Then the being described the man on the center cross with reverence that seemed inappropriate for an alien intelligence. It said, the One had taken human form, had lived among us for 33 years, teaching and healing and trying to show us a better way. Not through force or miracles that compelled belief, but through example and wisdom that appealed to the best parts of human nature. The One had walked among the poor and the outcast, had challenged the powerful and the self-righteous, had suggested that love and forgiveness mattered more than law and empire and the comfortable certainties that keep societies stable. And we had killed him for it. Killed him for threatening the power structures we'd built, for suggesting that maybe there was a better way than dominance and control and the endless cycle of violence that defined human civilization. The being's voice remained steady as it described the execution, but there was something beneath the words, something that sounded like sorrow or disappointment or a grief so profound it transcended species. It described how the One could have stopped it at any moment, could have called down power that would have reduced the Roman Empire to ash, could have revealed divinity in ways that would have forced belief, but that would have violated the entire purpose of the demonstration. Free will was the point. The choice to follow wisdom or reject it had to be genuine. So the One suffered and died like any human would, demonstrating divine love through sacrifice, showing that the message was worth dying for even if humans refused to listen. By the end of the 4th week, word had begun to spread through the base. You couldn't keep something like this contained, not when interrogation transcripts were being circulated for analysis, not when dozens of personnel were cycling through observation duty. Conversations in the mess hall grew quieter as people struggled with what they'd heard. Debates broke out in barracks late at night about whether the being was lying, whether the whole thing was some elaborate test of loyalty, whether the government was running a psychological operation on its own people. But those who'd spent the most time listening, who'd heard the being describe historical events with impossible accuracy, who'd watched it speak dead languages with native fluency, they were starting to believe. And belief was dangerous. During the 5th week, the being spoke about Earth's place in the cosmic order. It explained that we were not the only species the One had visited directly, but we were the only one that had rejected the message so completely and for so long. Other worlds had listened, had learned, had grown into civilizations that spanned star systems and existed in harmony with each other and their environments. They had achieved what the being called true enlightenment, not through superior intelligence, but through superior wisdom, through choosing cooperation over competition, through valuing life and growth over power and accumulation. Those civilizations had become worthy, the being said. They had proven themselves capable of receiving more of the One's knowledge. They were advancing towards something humans couldn't even imagine. But Earth remained stuck, trapped in cycles of violence and exploitation that other species had moved beyond millennia ago. 2,000 years since the One walked among us, and we had learned nothing. We still chose war over peace, still valued profit over people, still destroyed our own environment for short-term gain. The being spoke of watching human history unfold with growing concern, observing as we developed technologies that could either save us or destroy us. Technologies that amplified both our potential for transcendence and our capacity for catastrophe. We were approaching a critical threshold, the being said, a point where our choices would determine which path became locked in. That's when the being first mentioned the visions. It said that some among their kind had been granted glimpses of possible futures by the One, shown to them as both warning and guidance. These were not fixed prophecies, not predetermined outcomes, but potentials. Branches of reality that could be reached depending on the choices humanity made in the coming years. The being described 2 primary futures it had seen, 2 destinations so different they might as well be different universes entirely. The contrast between them made my blood run cold, even as my rational mind insisted it was impossible, that the whole thing had to be manipulation or delusion or something other than genuine divine revelation. In one future, humanity found its way back to the One's teachings, not through religious revival or forced conversion, but through genuine understanding that grew from the bottom up. War ended not through enforcement, but through collective realization that cooperation served everyone better than conflict. Resources were shared because compassion became more valued than accumulation, because people understood that hoarding while others suffered was a form of violence. Technology advanced not for profit or military advantage, but for the benefit of all living things, used to heal the earth and expand human potential rather than control and destroy. The planet recovered. Ecosystems restored themselves, and humanity spread to the stars not as conquerors but as grateful students of creation, ready to join the galactic community of enlightened species. It was heaven made manifest. Paradise achieved not through divine intervention but through human choice. The being described cities where hunger didn't exist, where medical care was universal, where education was a right rather than a commodity. It described societies where creativity flourished because people were freed from the constant struggle for survival, where scientific advancement accelerated because knowledge was shared freely rather than locked behind patents and profits. It described a world where humans finally lived according to their highest ideals, where the principles the one had taught were not just believed but practiced, where compassion and wisdom guided decision-making at every level, from individual to global. In the other future, humanity continued its current trajectory toward catastrophe. Climate change rendered vast regions of the planet uninhabitable, triggering waves of migration and conflict that overwhelmed every international institution. Wars over dwindling resources killed billions. Nuclear weapons finally used in desperation by nations facing collapse. Technology turned inward and dark, creating surveillance states where artificial intelligence monitored every citizen, where autonomous weapons systems made killing more efficient than ever before. The social contract dissolved completely as wealth concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite who retreated behind walls and private security while the masses fought over scraps. It was hell on earth, self-inflicted, the logical conclusion of choosing self-interest over collective good, of following fear and greed rather than wisdom and compassion. The being described collapsed cities overrun by violence, described oceans rising to swallow coastal regions where billions lived, described famines that made historical catastrophes look mild by comparison. It described a world where human life became cheap because there was too much suffering and too little hope, where the bonds of civilization frayed and snapped under the weight of perpetual crisis. And through it all, though one would watch and mourn, as any creator mourns a beloved work that destroys itself through free will. The divine would not intervene, would not save humanity from itself, because the entire point was the choice. We were free to choose heaven or hell. That freedom was sacred even when we chose wrong. The being admitted during the 6th week that they did not fully understand the mechanisms by which one future would be reached over the other. They could see the destinations with clarity, could describe the end states in vivid detail, but the specific path humanity needed to walk remained mysterious. They could observe the end points, but not identify the exact decisions that would push us toward heaven or hell. That's why they were here, the being said, watching, recording, trying to comprehend the mechanics of human choice, hoping to find some insight they could offer that might help guide us toward the good future before the window closed forever. But Earth's leadership, the being said with something approaching contempt, was not cooperating. Every time they had tried to make contact throughout history, to share what they knew, governments seized the opportunity for advantage rather than enlightenment. They studied the beings as potential weapons rather than messengers, locked them away rather than listening to their warnings, buried the truth under classification and denial rather than letting humanity make an informed choice about its future. The leadership of every nation was choosing the path to hell and dragging everyone else along, not through malice necessarily, but through the same short-sighted self-interest that had characterized human power structures throughout history. By the middle of the 6th week, the mood on the base had shifted from curiosity to tension. Personnel were dividing into camps, those who dismissed the being's testimony as elaborate deception, and those who couldn't shake the feeling that something profound was being revealed. Arguments broke out over mealtimes, debates that started about theology but quickly became about duty and loyalty, and what it meant to serve when the truth you were protecting might be the most important truth in human history. Officers who'd spent decades following orders without question found themselves lying awake at night wondering if keeping this secret was the right thing to do or the greatest crime they'd ever committed. The first sign of real trouble came when 3 junior officers requested permission to contact civilian religious leaders about what they'd heard. Their request was denied immediately, and they were confined to quarters pending security review. The message was clear. This information was not leaving the base through proper channels, and anyone who tried would face consequences that made career destruction look gentle. But the confinement only made things worse. Now there were martyrs, people being punished for wanting to share truth, and that changed the calculation for everyone watching. This wasn't just about keeping secrets anymore. This was about actively suppressing information that might save humanity from itself. During the final days of the 6th week, small groups began forming in the barracks late at night. Nothing organized, nothing that could be called conspiracy yet. Just people talking about what they'd heard and what it meant and what they should do about it. Some argued for going through proper channels, writing letters to congressmen or military chaplains, or anyone who might have both clearance and conscience. Others pointed out that those channels had been designed to contain exactly this kind of information, that any official complaint would be buried faster than you could file it. A few suggested more direct action, leaking information to the press or to civilian oversight committees. But everyone knew what happened to whistleblowers in the national security apparatus. One communications specialist tried smuggling out a recording on a thumb drive concealed in a hollowed-out belt buckle. He made it past 3 checkpoints before the exit scanners detected the anomaly. The drive was confiscated, analyzed, and found to contain 17 minutes of interrogation audio. The specialist was arrested immediately, charged under espionage statutes and transferred to a military prison. Last anyone heard, he was serving 25 years with no possibility of parole. His attempted leak accomplished nothing except to make security even tighter and remind everyone what happened when you tried to circumvent the system. Another group tried a different approach. 3 analysts spent weeks creating a detailed technical report, documenting the interrogations, carefully worded to appear like standard intelligence analysis, while including enough specifics about the being's testimony to make the religious implications clear. They routed it through proper channels, submitted it to the oversight committee responsible for monitoring classified programs, and waited for a response. The response came swiftly. All 3 were removed from the program, their security clearances suspended pending review, their report classified at levels above their own clearance and sealed. They'd tried to follow the rules and been crushed anyway. A military chaplain attempted to contact his superiors in the chaplaincy corps, arguing that testimony about divine matters fell under his religious authority rather than security classification. He wrote a detailed letter describing what he'd witnessed, emphasizing the theological implications, requesting permission to consult with religious scholars outside the military structure. The letter was intercepted before it left the base. The chaplain was confined to quarters, subjected to psychiatric evaluation, and ultimately discharged on medical grounds that would prevent him from ever serving in any government capacity again. His career destroyed, his credibility ruined, his testimony dismissed as a psychological break rather than a crisis of conscience. Each failed attempt made the situation worse. Security tightened further. Communications were monitored more closely. Personnel were rotated out faster to prevent long-term exposure to the interrogations. Command was learning from each breach attempt, plugging holes, perfecting the containment. The message was clear. This information would never leave the base through any official channel or individual action. The only way to break the silence was through coordinated uprising, through enough people acting together that they couldn't all be silenced. And that required organization that would be detected the moment it began. I found myself attending one of these late-night discussions in the 4th week of my assignment. I hadn't planned to get involved, hadn't intended to do anything but observe and file my reports, but I couldn't stay silent anymore. The being's testimony had gotten under my skin, had challenged everything I believed about the universe and humanity's place in it. I listened as a veteran intelligence analyst laid out the problem with painful clarity. If the being was telling the truth, then humanity needed to know. The choice between heaven and hell was too important to be made in ignorance. But if anyone tried to reveal this information, they would be crushed by the same government apparatus they'd spent their careers serving. The truth would die with them and nothing would change. Someone suggested trying to smuggle out documentation, recordings of the interrogations that could be released anonymously to multiple news organizations simultaneously. The technical challenges were discussed in detail. All communications were monitored. Physical media was checked at every security checkpoint. Even if you managed to get something out of the base, how would you contact journalists without leaving a trail? And would they even publish it? An anonymous package claiming the government had an alien that witnessed the crucifixion would be dismissed as an elaborate hoax, another conspiracy theory for the pile. You'd need corroboration, multiple independent sources, evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. And gathering that evidence would require coordination that would be detected immediately. As the 6th week ended, a plan began to form among the more committed believers. Nothing written down, nothing that could be intercepted, just verbal agreements made in moments of privacy. They would wait for the right opportunity, maybe during a shift change or a drill when security was focused elsewhere. A small group would seize the interrogation chamber, secure the being, and barricade themselves in with enough supplies to last days if necessary. They would demand negotiations, demand that command agree to release the interrogation records and free the entity. They would threaten to destroy the facility if their demands weren't met, using the base's own security systems against it. It was desperate and probably suicidal, but they decided that some truths were worth dying for. I should have reported what I was hearing. That was my duty as a federal agent, my obligation under every oath I'd sworn, but I didn't. I told myself I was gathering intelligence, maintaining cover, trying to understand the full scope of what was developing. But the truth was simpler and more damning. Part of me wanted them to succeed. Part of me believed the being's testimony about the one and the two futures. Believed humanity deserved to know what was being hidden in the deep places underground. And part of me was too much of a coward to join them, but too conflicted to stop them. So I stayed silent and watched as good people made plans that would almost certainly get them killed. The rebellion began during the midnight shift on a Wednesday, 43 days after I'd arrived at the base. The conspirators moved with military precision, coordinating through prearranged signals, overwhelming the guards through surprise rather than violence. They took control of 3 critical sections: the detention level where the being was held, the armory where they could equip themselves, and the communications hub where they could broadcast their demands. Within 20 minutes, they'd established defensive positions and sealed themselves in. Blast doors dropped and security protocols engaged. Command woke to find a third of the base in hostile hands and the most valuable intelligence asset in human history held by rebels who were demanding its release. The initial negotiations were tense but non-violent. The rebel commander, a decorated colonel who'd spent 30 years following orders without question, made their position clear. They were not traitors. They were patriots who'd discovered that their government was suppressing information vital to humanity's survival. They would surrender peacefully if command agreed to 3 conditions: release the complete interrogation records to the public, allow the being to address the world directly, and grant immunity to everyone involved. Otherwise, they would hold their positions indefinitely, and if command tried to take them by force, they would destroy enough of the facility to ensure the truth came out in the aftermath. Command's response was unequivocal. The rebels were engaged in mutiny and would be treated as hostile combatants. No negotiations, no immunity, no release of classified information under any circumstances. They had 24 hours to surrender unconditionally or face the consequences. The message was clear. The government would rather see everyone in that base dead than let this truth reach the public. I listened to the radio traffic from my position in a section still under command control, trapped between my duty to the government I served and my growing belief that the rebels were right. The standoff lasted 3 days. During that time, both sides tried to sway personnel who hadn't committed to either camp. The rebels broadcast their reasoning through the base's internal communications, explaining what they'd heard, why they believed it, why this truth was too important to bury. They played excerpts from the interrogations, the being's voice describing the crucifixion, and the two futures with that clinical precision that made dismissal impossible. Command countered with appeals to duty and threats of prosecution, reminding everyone that their security clearances bound them to silence regardless of what they'd heard, that violating those oaths meant prison at minimum. I found myself moving through the base during those 3 days, talking to people on both sides, trying to understand what was happening. The loyal personnel were frightened and angry, convinced the rebels had been compromised somehow. that the being had used some form of mind control or psychological manipulation to turn good soldiers against their country. The rebels were determined and at peace with their choice, convinced they were doing the right thing, even if it cost them everything. And caught between them were people like me, conflicted and paralyzed, believing the rebels might be right, but too afraid of the consequences to act on that belief. On the third day, I made my decision. I would join the rebels. The being's testimony about the One was too compelling to dismiss, the choice between futures too important to ignore. If humanity was really approaching a branching point where heaven or hell would be determined by our choices, then keeping this information secret was itself a choice, the wrong choice, the one that led toward catastrophe. I made my way toward rebel-held territory, ready to declare my allegiance, ready to face whatever consequences followed. But I was too late. The assault came before I reached the rebel lines, sudden and overwhelming. Reinforcements had arrived from outside the base, and they were nothing anyone had anticipated. Soldiers in powered exoskeletons that turned them into walking tanks. Technology so advanced it seemed impossible. Armor that made them invulnerable to the small arms the rebels had available. They breached the sealed sections with cutting torches that burned through blast doors like paper, advanced through choke points without slowing, weathered gunfire that should have stopped them cold. The fighting was brutal and one-sided. The rebels never had a chance. The exoskeleton troops moved through the base like mechanical angels of death, crushing resistance with overwhelming force, leaving no survivors, taking no prisoners. I watched through security feeds as positions fell one by one, as good men and women were cut down without mercy, as the colonel made his last stand in the communications hub with a dozen soldiers who'd chosen to die rather than surrender. They fought until ammunition ran out, then fought with knives and improvised weapons, then with bare hands. The exoskeleton troops killed them all with mechanical efficiency, confirmed each kill, and moved to the next position. Within 4 hours, the rebellion was over. Every rebel was dead, their bodies processed and removed with the same efficiency that had killed them. The sections they'd held were sterilized, every surface scrubbed clean of evidence, every piece of equipment examined and catalogued. The being was secured and moved to a deeper facility, one even more secret than this base, where it could be questioned without interference. And those of us who'd survived but hadn't joined either side were processed through debriefings that made clear exactly what was expected of us. The official story was simple and final. There had been a training accident, a catastrophic failure of environmental systems that had killed 47 personnel before containment could be established. Families were notified, benefits paid, heroes honored with posthumous medals for dying in service to their country. No mention of rebellion. No hint of what they'd actually fought for. No acknowledgement that they'd chosen to die for truth, rather than live with silence. Their deaths were reframed as tragedy rather than choice, their courage erased as thoroughly as their bodies. I was debriefed by officers whose faces I've forgotten, in rooms that officially don't exist, under threat of prosecution that would see me imprisoned for the rest of my natural life if I ever spoke about what I'd witnessed. They told me the rebels were traitors who'd endangered national security, that their deaths were necessary and justified, that the information they'd tried to reveal would have caused panic and chaos if released. They told me to file my final report, return to normal duties, and never speak of this assignment again, and I agreed. Signed every document they put in front of me, swore every oath they required, because I was afraid. And I convinced myself that survival mattered more than truth. As I returned to my life in the FBI, to my cases and my desk and my comfortable certainty that I was one of the good guys. But something had broken inside me during those 6 weeks underground. The being's testimony about the One echoed in my mind during sleepless nights. The rebels' willingness to die for truth haunted my dreams. I'd been given a choice between courage and cowardice, between speaking truth and protecting myself, and I'd chosen wrong. I told myself I was being smart, practical, realistic about what one person could accomplish against the power of the national security state. But I knew the truth. I was a coward who'd let good people die rather than stand with them. The years passed. I rose through the Bureau's ranks, earned commendations and promotions, built a career that looked successful from the outside. But I never forgot what I'd heard in that interrogation chamber. Never stopped thinking about the choice humanity was approaching, never stopped wondering if we'd already passed the branching point and locked ourselves into the hell future. I watched the news with growing dread, saw climate change accelerating, saw conflicts multiplying, saw the social fabric fraying exactly as the being had described, and I said nothing, did nothing, kept the secret I'd been ordered to keep because I'd chosen survival over truth 47 years ago, and didn't have the courage to unmake that choice. Now I'm dying. Cancer, aggressive and inoperable, spreading through my body with the same inexorable certainty that humanity seems to be approaching the future the being warned about. The doctors give me weeks at most, maybe days if the next round of decline comes fast. And for the first time in 47 years, I'm ready to tell the truth, ready to break the silence I've kept for most of my adult life. Not because I've suddenly found courage, but because I've run out of time, and I can't carry this secret to my grave without at least trying to unburden myself. The priest arrived this morning. I didn't ask for him, but the hospice staff assumes a dying man wants spiritual comfort, and I didn't have the energy to refuse. He's young, earnest, probably fresh from seminary, with his faith intact and his certainty unshaken. He's reading the last rites now, the formal ritual of preparing a soul for death, and I want to laugh at the irony. Here I am, a man who spent 6 weeks listening to an alien describe God's plan for humanity, receiving final sacraments from someone who's never questioned whether God exists at all. The morphine makes everything feel distant and dreamlike, but the memories from 47 years ago remain sharp. I can still see the being's face as it described the crucifixion, still hear the precise clinical tone as it explained the two futures. I can still remember the weight of the decision I faced, the moment when I could have chosen courage and chose survival instead. That moment defines everything that came after. All the years of success and silence. All the nights lying awake knowing I'd failed the most important test I'd ever been given. I interrupt him mid-prayer. Tell him I have something to confess. He settles into the bedside chair with practiced patience, probably expecting the usual deathbed admissions of adultery or theft or some other venial sin. Instead, I tell him everything. The base in Nevada, the being from Roswell, the interrogations that lasted 6 weeks, the testimony about the one and the crucifixion and the two futures humanity could still choose between, the rebellion of good people who tried to share this truth, their massacre by soldiers in exoskeletons that shouldn't exist, my cowardice in staying silent for 47 years while the world moved closer to the hell the being had described. The priest listens with an expression that shifts from patience to confusion to concern. When I finish, he's quiet for a long moment. Then he speaks with gentle condescension, the tone people use with the mentally unstable. He tells me that deathbed visions are common, that the mind sometimes creates elaborate fantasies as it approaches the end. He suggests the morphine might be affecting my cognition. He assures me that God forgives all sins, that whatever I actually did or didn't do during my FBI career, I can find peace in confession and absolution. He doesn't believe a word I've said. He thinks I'm dying and delusional and in need of comfort rather than truth. I should have expected this reaction. Who would believe such a story from a dying man with no evidence? The government destroyed all the proof decades ago, eliminated every witness, buried the truth under layers of classification that will outlast any freedom of information request. The rebels who tried to expose this died with their knowledge. The being is still imprisoned somewhere even deeper than that Nevada base, probably moved multiple times over the years, questioned by new generations of interrogators who each swear the same oaths of secrecy I swore. The truth survives only in the memories of those few of us who heard it and lacked the courage to share it. I want to be angry, but I'm too tired. Of course he doesn't believe. Why would he? I sound exactly like the conspiracy theorists I spent my career dismissing. The believers in alien cover-ups and government secrets who saw patterns in noise and meaning in coincidence. Without evidence, without corroboration, my testimony is just the rambling of a dying man whose mind is failing along with his body. The truth dies with me, just like it died with the rebels 47 years ago, just like it's been dying in classified files and unmarked graves for decades. The government won this round like it wins every round, through overwhelming force and perfect silence. But I have to try one more time, have to make him understand even if he won't believe. I grip the priest's hand with strength I didn't know I still had and tell him to listen, really listen, because this matters more than anything else I'll say before I die. God is real. Not real in the abstract theological sense, not real as a matter of faith or belief, but real in the concrete historical sense. The one walked on earth 2,000 years ago, taught us how to avoid destroying ourselves, was killed for offering that wisdom. And we've learned nothing since. We're approaching the moment where our choices will determine whether we build heaven or hell on earth. And our leaders have chosen to bury the truth rather than let us choose wisely. The being said, "The one is patient, but time is not infinite." The branching point is coming, maybe already here, where one future becomes locked in and the other fades to impossibility. Every day we choose violence over peace, profit over people, power over wisdom. We take another step toward the hell future. Climate catastrophe, resource wars, social collapse, technological horror, all of it preventable if we just follow the teachings, the one delivered personally. But we won't listen. We never listen. We're too stubborn, too proud, too committed to the systems that are killing us to imagine anything better. I tell the priest about the specifics of the hell future as the being described it, not vague apocalyptic imagery, but concrete predictions about how civilization would collapse, rising temperatures making equatorial regions uninhabitable, triggering mass migration that would overwhelm borders and governments, conflicts over water and arable land escalating to nuclear exchanges that would poison regions for generations. Artificial intelligence systems used not for human benefit but for totalitarian control, surveillance states that would make freedom itself obsolete, wealth concentration so extreme that a handful of people would control more resources than billions, while the masses fought over scraps in a world stripped of hope and possibility. And I tell him about the heaven future, the one we could still reach if we chose differently. Not a utopia without problems, but a world where humanity finally aligned its actions with its stated values, where technology served human flourishing rather than corporate profit, where resources were shared because cooperation had proven more beneficial than competition, where conflicts were resolved through dialogue because violence had been recognized as the ultimate failure of imagination. The being describes cities powered by clean energy, food systems that fed everyone without destroying ecosystems, medical advances that made suffering optional, educational systems that developed human potential instead of sorting winners from losers. It was achievable, practical, possible, if we wanted it more than we wanted the comfortable, familiar hell we were building. I tell the priest that my greatest sin isn't anything I did during my FBI career. It's what I didn't do. I heard truth that could have saved humanity, and I stayed silent. I watched good people die trying to share that truth, and I didn't join them. I spent 47 years protecting myself instead of protecting the future, and now it's too late. I'm dying, and the truth dies with me, and humanity stumbles forward in ignorance toward a catastrophe that could have been avoided if I'd had the courage to speak 47 years ago when it might have mattered. The priest doesn't know what to say. He offers me absolution anyway, going through the ritual motions, speaking the formal words that are supposed to cleanse the soul and prepare it for judgment. But I don't feel absolved. I don't feel forgiven. I feel like a man who was given one chance to do something that mattered and chose safety over courage, silence over truth, survival over redemption. The being said we were free to choose heaven or hell. I made my choice. I chose hell, not just for myself but for everyone who will inherit the future I helped hide. As the priest finishes the last rites and prepares to leave, I ask him one final question. What if I'm not delusional? What if everything I've told him is true? What if there really was an alien that witnessed the crucifixion, that warned us about the choice we're approaching, that tried to guide us toward heaven instead of hell? What if governments really do have secrets that important buried in underground bases, protected by classification and force? What if humanity really is running out of time to choose differently before it's too late? What would he do with that knowledge? The priest is silent for a long moment. Then he says what I already know he'll say. He'd pray. He'd trust in God's plan. He'd have faith that divine will would prevail regardless of human choice or human failure. It's the answer of someone whose certainty has never been truly tested, someone who's never been forced to choose between faith and action, between belief and consequence. It's the answer of someone who's never heard the one's message delivered with the authority of an eyewitness and felt the weight of responsibility that comes with that knowledge. He leaves and I'm alone with my morphine drip and my failing body and my memories of 6 weeks that changed everything and 47 years of cowardice that changed nothing. The being's voice echoes in my mind one final time, describing the two futures with clinical precision: heaven or hell, enlightenment or catastrophe, paradise or apocalypse. The choice is ours. The choice has always been ours. And I helped ensure we'd make it in ignorance rather than wisdom, in darkness rather than light. I'm dying now, really dying, feeling life drain away with each labored breath, and my final thought, the last thing I'll carry into whatever comes next, is this: I'm sorry. Sorry to the one for failing to share the message. Sorry to the rebels who died trying to do what I was too afraid to attempt. Sorry to humanity for helping bury the truth that might have saved us. Sorry to myself for living 47 years as a coward instead of dying with honor alongside people who understood that some truths are worth any price. God is real and was waiting for us. Time ran out. We chose wrong. I chose wrong. And now it's too late to choose again. That's the truth I carry to my grave. The confession that dies unheard. The warning that will never reach the people who need to hear it. The being was right about everything, especially about us. We're the only species stubborn enough to reject divine wisdom even when offered directly. We're choosing hell because heaven requires change, and change requires courage, and courage is exactly what I lacked when it mattered most. The darkness is coming now, pulling me down, and I welcome it because at least in death I won't have to live with what I know anymore. Won't have to watch humanity stumble toward catastrophe. Won't have to carry the weight of truth that I was too afraid to share. The being said, the one mourns when beloved creation destroys itself through free will. I hope the one mourns for me too, for the coward who heard truth and stayed silent, who had one chance to matter and chose survival instead. I hope there's mercy for those who fail through weakness rather than malice. I hope, but I don't expect it. I don't deserve it. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.